Thank you so much, Ashish, for sitting with me here today. I'm hoping we can explore a few things. Your arguably bold but highly principled campaign that you've launched, and the larger pro-Palestinian activism in which it's situated. And so to open, perhaps we can address what the idea behind the campaign, No Tax for Genocide.
Yeah, and I'll give you some background of why it works as well, right? Think of 34,000 people killed, 1.2 million people displaced. That was the Bosnian genocide. Those numbers sound eerily familiar to today, right? So right now we're talking about over 40,000 killed in Gaza. We're talking about 70 to 100,000 people injured, probably a lot more if you consider how many people are trapped under the rubble. Nearly 2 million people displaced, probably the full population displaced if you consider all the buildings have basically been destroyed. Hospitals taken out, education facilities taken out, sanctuaries like faith institutions taken out. This is a genocide. The ICJ ruling it's a plausible genocide. Francesca Albanese's report, An Anatomy of a Genocide, basically calling it that. And the reason all of that is important is this No Tax for Genocide campaign doesn't work without all those things being put out in the open, right? Those things actually being ruled on, being voiced upon, experts, genocide survivors, all these people out there saying, this is what it is, right? And the reason that's important is because two laws make this reasonable. The ICC Act of 2001 make it illegal for people to participate in war crimes like genocide. And that's people as well as governments or institutions or businesses. And then the second act is the Terrorism Act of 2000, which does not exclude taxation from the funding of those mass atrocities. And that's really important because, you could argue that, traditionally when these things are funded, it's privately funded or it's done like that. Well, how do you think these were funded in Nazi Germany? How do you think they were funded in Serbia? How do you think they were funded in Rwanda? They use government money to buy those arms. They use government money to do those things. And that's why that's important as well. And the third thing is we're not telling people not to pay tax. They're withholding their tax in a revocable trust. And that's important because I want people to know that, you're not going away tomorrow and not paying your tax. What you're doing is you're putting in a trust, almost like an escrow bank account. And you're saying, hey, the government is your primary beneficiary of this trust. But guess what? They have to prove that they're not aiding or abetting a genocide to receive those funds.
So yes, I think it's an important distinction you're making between tax resistance and what other people might unfairly call it tax evasion.
Yeah, 100%. And this is still resistance. Right. Remember, the government, we're trying to say to the government, you can't have our money if it funds mass atrocities. And it's a way for the British public to basically show their muscle and show the politicians who they actually work for. Because I think the British public have felt gaslit. I think the ceasefire, just the ceasefire, forget what side you're on, forget what your beliefs are, just ceasefire right now, I think it's in the 80% in the UK. Right? We are there where the vast majority of the public just wants the killing to stop, wants the mass atrocities of Palestinians to stop. They don't want to wake up every morning and look on their phone and see more babies blown to bits, more families torn apart, more land stolen. They don't want to see any of that. And what this campaign says to the politicians is, you haven't listened to us. We've marched, we've protested, and those things are still important. People should still do those because it shows solidarity to your Palestinian brothers and sisters. But it's really important for us to now show the British government that they're not in charge. We'll defund you. We'll actually take the money away from the government and all its actions to show you how much we care about this atrocity stopping today.
Yes, and to your point, the government, which of course has not been advertising this as an option that you can do if you don't like what is happening. As I'm sure you know, the Revenue and Customs Authority issued this statement. So I call this sort of the devil's advocate question. And I just want to give you the chance, of course, to reply. So I have it here, the statement verbatim. And in response to your campaign, they've said this: there are no provisions for anyone to withhold tax or decide which part of government expenditure they would like their payments allocated to or excluded from on grounds of conscience. So how do you reply?
Well, it's interesting because you've got accountants and tax lawyers telling you there's no provision to withhold tax. Right. Well, this is not about accountants or tax lawyers. Look, any good accountant, I have an accountant because I live in the United States and you've got to file your tax every year, right? My accountant is not going to tell me to withhold my tax. If he's doing his job, he wants you to live a legal citizen's life and not he'd tell me this is illegal, Ash, right? And I don't know how this is legal. But it's not about that. It's about, you need war lawyers, specialists, you need international human rights lawyers, you need people who understand war law. Like people who understand why these international laws and domestic laws apply in a way to protect you as a citizen from having to be like effectively complicit in a genocide, right? Because HMRC might say, yes, there is probably no provision naturally to withhold your tax, but what they're not accounting for is their own British laws, their own international law treaties that they've signed up that says, British citizen, you cannot fund a genocide. And they don't know how to deal with this because guess what? We've never actually, at least publicly, aided and abetted a genocide the way we are doing today. And I don't think anyone in HMRC is qualified to talk about whether the ICC Act actually protects British citizens from being complicit when they withhold their tax.
Right. And you're trying to get 100,000?
Yeah.
100,000. So once you reach that, what would the next step?
We'll enact this. We're trying to get 100,000 pledges, and then we'll enact that. And that, to give you a rough estimate, yes, that would be effectively £700 million on an average salary, $1 billion out of the British budget. And that might not sound like a lot when you think about, the budget of the United States, which is in the trillions. But Britain is only 65 million people. 38 million, maybe 40 million pay tax if you exclude children and pensioners and other retired people. 100,000 people that accumulates to a lot of money, and the goal is to keep going. This doesn't end when those 100,000 sign up. This doesn't end once we enact the first 100,000. This continues, and as this gets bigger, hopefully we have 1, 2, 3 million. 3 million people is about 10% of the tax-paying budget. I think that would shut down the British government's operations. In some term that we're so used to here in the US with a government shutdown being threatened, it'd be the first time the UK government would actually not be able to operate without any tax revenue. And people go, well, that's going to damage my NHS, that's going to damage this. No, the government has a choice to stop committing and supporting and aiding and abetting in a mass atrocity and put British citizens' priorities first, frankly, not the Israeli citizens' priorities first. Like, do Israel need the weaponry? Do Israel need more political support? Do Israel need all of that before you'll care for the British citizens?
Right. And if this campaign succeeds in the way that you envision or are hoping, what are some of the tangible or concrete outcomes you expecting to see, like almost immediately?
Well, we immediately want the British government to enforce a ceasefire, not just call for a ceasefire, actually actively want to enforce a ceasefire. That means being part of a coalition that is not led by the United States, because it has shown itself not to be a fair player in this unrest right now in Gaza, this atrocity happening in Gaza. Join a coalition of international forces to actually put peacekeepers on the ground, to actually enforce this, to actually hold Israel accountable, to also, when I say accountability, to sign on with everybody else who actually knows this is a genocide. What's really fascinating to me is the UK and the US, the last two nations probably not calling it a genocide in terms of like traditional powers, right? France is kind of already saying that their citizens who have participated in this could be prosecuted for this if they've committed war crimes. Other countries in Europe are saying the same thing, from Norway to Belgium, and other people have said that if our dual citizens are there committing, they're basically admitting there are war crimes. What's also interesting is the UK's lawyers have also given advice to the government that have said that Israel is in breach of international humanitarian law. Israel is committing war crimes. That has not been published, which obviously is the hole in the British government's argument that this is not a genocide. And the reason that's important is it's not up to politicians or press secretaries who know nothing about genocide, who know nothing about ethnic cleansing, who have no legal background in any of these topics, to go on a podium and say, oh, we don't believe it's a genocide, right? Where is the British government's experts? And where is the State Department's experts? Why are they not at the front of the press conference? Because I'll tell you why they're not there as someone who worked for the Middle East peace envoy. Because no one credible in this space will put their name out there to say this is not a genocide right now. When the UN is putting people out there who are credible, calling it what it is, when courts are doing that, when courts have also ruled that, I take the Netherlands, for example, when they said they believe this is a genocide, or at least a plausible genocide, and we believe the Netherlands government should not provide any more parts for the F-35 fighter or the F-15 fighter. Everybody's ruling it what it is. And the interesting thing for me is watching the US and the UK have no expert in this space or scholar willing to put their name on paper or go out in a press conference and say this is not a genocide. Because you know what? They know it is.
Right. And they're not legally or morally, of course, supposed to be doing this. And I'm wondering, and here's maybe where there's some irony, has there been any UK government push, or any legal action, I should say, that the UK government has threatened because of this campaign?
Not so far. I think they don't want to draw more attention to it. Because if they put that out there that they want to go and directly confront this campaign, guess what? They'll have to go to court at one point. And we welcome that, right? So if we enact this 100,000 people, we welcome the idea of going to court to discuss whether this is a genocide. Right. Because I really doubt a UK judge is going to rule against the ICJ. I really doubt a UK judge alone on the island of the United Kingdom is going to rule against what the Netherlands have said. It's going to rule against what the United States, a federal judge in the United States said when the Center for Constitutional Rights tried to take Biden to court for not preventing a genocide earlier this year. The case was thrown out because the judge said because of the separation of powers, it wasn't his responsibility. It was Congress's responsibility to actually hold the president account for this. Now that decision is being appealed. But what was really important with that, he gave his opinion, and he's a federal judge appointed by Joe Biden. He's basically a centrist, right? And he wrote in that, I believe it's a plausible genocide, and I would recommend the White House stop sending weapons. There is no judge who has credibility that's willing to rule this. And I welcome the idea that the British government would take this campaign to court once it's enacted and say, because we will make sure that everybody is represented together as a class action suit, right? We're not going to go and let somebody be prosecuted by themselves. And if they try to target one person, we'll make sure that case is about the whole campaign. And the reason this is important is I welcome the idea of them having a debate about whether this is a genocide, whether war crimes have been committed, because their own legal advice has said this, and they would have to publish it. They would have to bring it to the British public. And I would welcome this all being played out in the open so they could defend their position of how they literally have indiscriminately allowed the killing of so many Palestinians.
Yes. And it would just, I mean, once you open up that discourse, it would just be impossible. So I suppose they're avoiding that as much as possible. In terms of how your campaign succeeds or pans out, how do you think it might set a precedent for other anti-genocidal campaigns worldwide? Or
yeah, I mean, the thing is, I think the one thing, the reason this campaign is so innovative is the laws were written for it to legally be allowed, right? So like, I think of the law as actually powerful, right? Most laws were not written for us, frankly. They weren't written for the global south. Most international human rights laws weren't written for the collective peoples of this world. They're written for the global north. They were written for the tiny pocket of the west. But the law is power and can be used for emancipatory struggles, right? Everything is written there can be used against the governments who actually enacted these laws. I'm sure when they wrote these laws that were about funding of terrorism and about that, they weren't expecting, wait, they could be used against us, right? The innovation in that is reading the own language they put down on paper to go after them. In the same way they would go after a foreign terrorist group who's funded by another nation state, whose public don't have anything to do with that terrorist group, but then that country has been sanctioned, and the public in that country have been sanctioned because guess what? They contribute to the tax coffers of that country supporting that terrorist group. Well, that's exactly what we're doing to the British government. And I believe there are more laws written like that across the globe in each country. If people look hard enough, they'll find that it doesn't exclude taxation. They'll find that we've signed up to the ICC statute, the Rome Statute. But they'll also find that we also made our own laws domestically in multiple countries to enforce that even firmer about terrorism, war crimes, and genocide. And with that, they'll find that there might be a way for them to withhold taxation in their country, right? And every country will be different. You have to go through this diligently. But what this shows that is the law can be used for your struggle to support you in any action against your own government when it is committing a genocide.
Right. Could you speak a little bit about the kind of work that the lawyers you're working with are doing?
Yeah. So a lot of the work before this that we've been doing is trying to hold the White House, the Israeli government, and other people who supported this genocide, aided and abetted it, accountable. And it's also the frustration for the public in this, right? There is only a handful of lawyers in the world that can do this work. So it's why we did the No Tax for Genocide campaign, because The reality is most of the public have protested, marched every week, felt gaslit, and desperately want to do more. They desperately want to do more, and that's what the No Tax for Genocide campaign gives them. But the other stuff we're working on is using universal jurisdiction, because often the ICJ and the ICC historically hasn't prosecuted people who've committed these atrocities. Like Israel has been let off the hook a lot of times. This isn't the first time they've tried to ethnically cleanse Palestinians. This isn't the first time they've committed atrocities. It goes back to 1948. We've never held anyone accountable for these actions. So, but the beautiful thing about universal jurisdiction is it allows domestic courts, and you've got to remember, it only works when the person has committed a crime against humanity, right? A crime that is a war crime, like genocide, like ethnic cleansing, and universal jurisdiction can be used by a domestic court, like a court in Ireland, in the UK, the highest courts in those lands, to prosecute people for international war crimes, for crimes against humanity. And what we have is a team of lawyers, a coalition of lawyers that include former prosecutors, former international ICC prosecutors, former prosecutors at domestic courts in other countries, other international human rights lawyers have come together and are working in universal jurisdiction cases in multiple countries right now to hold, and we're focusing our attention, and there are other people doing this for Israel, but we're focusing our attention on the United States. Because the United States is not just complicit. Biden is not just complicit. He hasn't just aided and abetted this genocide. They are overseeing this genocide. And we're not just naming President Biden, Secretary Blinken, Secretary Lloyd Austin. We're not just naming them in the lawsuits. Because I accept that it'll be time before those things see the light of day. We're naming all the staff. We're naming everyone from Karine Jean-Pierre. We're naming Matt Miller. The spokespeople have created an environment for this genocide to take place. The policy architects of this, like Jake Sullivan, basically the new Baghdad Bob, John Kirby, who literally lies to the public about what's going on every day. We are naming all of them because none of this would be possible without the complete assistance, the complete oversight of the United States government and its employees. And that's what they should all be afraid of, because the interesting thing with these universal jurisdiction cases is they're not going to end when this thing ends. They don't end. They're going to be arrest warrants out for these people at all levels. And while some might be protected by diplomatic immunity, I can guarantee you as a former employee of a government, not every government employee has diplomatic immunity. And the idea would have arrest warrants on all these individuals in multiple countries so they can't travel, so they can't do anything. And if they want to not answer those arrest warrants and want to be held account in public, they'll be stuck in the United States for the rest of their lives.
Thank you so much again, Ashish.
Thank you for having me.